What I want to do in this lesson is speak about the attempts to establish a constitutional monarchy. And this is following on from the period that we explored in the previous lesson, which was a period that stretched from the month of May of 1789 all the way to the month of October 1789. This period is going to be particularly with reference to 1789 to 1791, and specifically the specification tells us that we need to know about the attempts to establish a constitutional monarchy. This includes church reforms, political, judicial, and administrative reforms, as well as the economic and social changes that we see sweeping France during this particular period. And so with this in mind then, I want to begin by thinking about the reforms to the church. Now, the French Revolution deeply altered the relationship that existed between the state and the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church, if you remember, was seen as quite a significant cornerstone of the old Ancien Regime. And so these reforms that we can think of that take place from November 1789 onwards sought to essentially try and reduce the power and wealth of the church while also aligning it with the goals of the revolution. And one of the things that begins to take place at the start of this reform process is the November 1789 decision to nationalize church property. So essentially to nationalize something means to bring that into the ownership of the state. So for example, the NHS in the United Kingdom is a nationalized system in the sense that healthcare in the UK is under the remit of the state. And so when we think about the nationalisation of church property, the French government had to reconcile the fact that they were facing quite a severe financial crisis. The French Revolution itself begins not only as a backlash to absolutist monarchy of the Ancien Regime, but it also is in response to the financial crisis that was put into by the French state was put into by Louis XVI. And so in response to the financial crisis, the French government decided to confiscate church lands to try and address this problem and to alleviate this idea. So the November 1789 nationalisation policy was a plan to nationalise all church property, declaring it, quote, the property of the nation. The sale of these lands would provide crucial funds for the revolution, but it would also disrupt the influence that the church would have on the people. In July of 1790, we also see the establishment of the Civil Constitution of the Clergy. This was a law which restructured the role of the Catholic Church in France, making it instead subordinate to that of the state. And so with this in mind, one of the things that it did was it meant that bishops and priests were to be elected by the people rather than be appointed by the Pope or any kind of internal church hierarchy. In addition to this, the clergy were required to swear an oath of loyalty, not necessarily to the church, but instead to the Constitution. Now, generally speaking then, there are a number of consequences that we can think about in terms of the historical significance of these church reforms. The reforms themselves definitely divided the French population. Many of the clergy, in fact, refused to take the oath and instead became non-juring priests, is the title that they were given. And this obviously sparked a schism within the church itself. The Pope himself also condemned the establishment of the civil constitution, believing that it would further alienate devout Catholics, and the condemning of the constitution itself also went towards this further alienation of Catholics, creating further resistance in rural areas. And so really the church reforms ultimately alienated quite a lot of the French population, especially when we think about the conservative rural areas. And so this growing hostility towards the revolution, especially among devout Catholics, would ultimately lead to and contribute significantly to counter-revolutionary movements, such as the Vendée uprisings, which we will get to in future lessons' time. In terms of other elements of French society and the sort of French political structure, when we think about political, judicial, and administrative reforms, one of the things that we can see is the drafting of the French Constitution of 1791. The 1791 Constitution sought to establish a constitutional monarchy. This would be an attempt to establish a monarchy quite similar to that of what existed in England at the time, in Britain at the time, where they had their revolution a good century prior with the Glorious Revolution of 1688. The aim here is to balance power between the king and the legislature. With this in mind, then, the balance of power looked a little bit as follows. The king would retain executive power and have a suspensive veto on that of the making of new law, but was still nevertheless subordinate to the already established National Assembly. In addition to this, the legislative branch, which became known as the Legislative Assembly, was elected by a number of individuals, specifically a number of men who owned property. This was, of course, quite a limited suffrage, essentially a limited electorate, so a limited number of people were able to actually vote for the Legislative Assembly, and therefore a quite narrow segment of the population. The system ultimately, then, if we think conclusively about the establishment of the constitutional monarchy, the system ultimately aimed to create a government which was attempting to be accountable to the people, while also trying to retain the ceremonial role of the monarchy. The idea of overthrowing the monarchy was a particularly controversial and quite radical idea, even at this point in 1791. It's only when we start to think about the Jacobins and we start to think about Robespierre and we start to think about the establishment of the Reign of Terror that we see that overthrowing the monarchy is something that becomes a lot more palatable. So it's only with further radicalization of the revolution that we see further palatability of the idea of overthrowing monarchy. At least at this relatively, in inverted commas, early stage of the revolution, the French Constitution is still trying to retain a semblance of the old ways, if you will, the ceremonial role of the monarchy. In terms of judicial reforms, one of the things that we see is the abolition of the old system. So the old system of both royal courts on the one hand and feudal justice on the other was abolished, and instead we see a new system, a uniform judicial system which was introduced. This included the election of judges at every single level of the judiciary, as well as the introduction of the idea of the trial by jury for criminal cases. That's quite a significant reform. This also led to the simplification of laws and the introduction of new ideas relating to law and society and to sort of law and class, with the insurance of equality before the law. So generally speaking, very progressive, very liberal reforms in relation to the judiciary. Things like torture and cruel punishments were also abolished, again reflective of the more Enlightenment ideals relating to justice and the sort of imbued within the kind of political philosophy that existed at the time of the Enlightenment, of liberalism, and of the establishment of liberal constitutionalism. When it comes to the ways in which there were administrative reforms, the sort of old feudal administrative divisions that existed again was replaced. It was replaced instead with a more rational system of departments, of districts, and of communes. These were created in 1790. These divisions were governed by people who were elected, by elected officials. Again, elected officials with a relatively narrow electorate. Only people who were men who owned property were able to vote in all of these elections. But this process of establishing more divisions that was a little bit more rational, the sort of departments, districts, and communes system, was to essentially try and decentralize power. And this had a very key aim in mind. To decentralize the power was to reduce the king's authority over the ways in which local governance would take place. So this looks more towards the ways in which the local system of the French society would start to change and develop over time. In terms of some of the more important elements, you have to think about the economic reforms that we start to see during this period. So when it comes to economic reforms, there are sort of two major elements that we can think about. The first is the end of the feudal dues and privileges systems. This takes place as the result of the 1789 August decrees. It abolishes feudal dues, it abolishes privileges that are held by the nobility and by the clergy. The aim here was to try and eliminate the inequalities that existed under the old Ancien Regime, and also to try and free peasantry from oppressive obligations. Remember here that, of course, what we see in 1789 with the Declaration of Man and the August decrees is the fundamental and formal end of feudalism within French society. And so this is just one step towards the formal abolition of feudalism during this period. There is also the abolition of guilds. This is as the result of Le Chapiere's law from 1791. The Le Chapiere's law banned guilds, trade unions, and workers' associations because this was seen as reflective of the influence of liberal economics and liberal economic thought. The aim instead was to try and create a free labour market. But obviously, what we see with the abolition of guilds law was quite a significant uprising of workers. Of course, when you abolish trade unions, guilds, and workers' associations, you end up essentially seeing an angering of workers who saw this as an attack on their ability to negotiate free and fair wages, as well as fairer working conditions. When it comes to the idea of social reforms, we see the abolition of noble privileges. The nobility lost exclusive rights to a number of things that they did historically have exclusive rights over. This included things like hunting, tax exemptions, and positions in power that were representative by their authority within the government, but also within the military. Titles of nobility were also officially abolished as well. Again, the idea of equality before the law became a central feature of this new constitution. All of this sounds all well and good, but at the end of the day, this doesn't last for very long, and we will see this taking place when we carry on going through this period of history. Finally then, when thinking about social reforms, of course, all of these reforms that we see, not only within society, but also within the sort of political, judicial, administrative, even the economic reforms, were all aimed towards and geared towards a system of meritocratic government. So the reforms open the government and military positions to talent and merit rather than to birthright or social rank. The aim here is, of course, to try and promote upward mobility for the middle classes. So, with all of this being said then, what were the challenges that resulted from the constitutional monarchy? Because while this all sounded very, very nice and very, very liberal, and anybody who is a sort of liberal constitutionalist, who is a big fan of a constitution like the US Constitution, you might be thinking, well, this is all great stuff. Are we going to now learn about the history of the French devolving into a constitutional monarchy and turning into a utopian society? Well, ultimately, no is the answer to that question, because there were a number of significant challenges that resulted in this. Firstly, you have the fact that in June of 1791, King Louis XVI attempted to escape in the flight to Varennes. This was a place in Austria, but what it was more importantly was symbolic, because what it represented was King Louis XVI's unwillingness to fully embrace the establishment of constitutional monarchy under this new government. The event itself, the flight itself, and the sort of all the stuff that went around it, eroded public trust within the monarchy, and it also radicalized public opinion and strengthened the calls that were already present for the establishment not of a constitutional monarchy, but instead the establishment of a republic. And this is really where we start to see the growth of radicalism and also the growth of republicanism. People like the Jacobins and the Sans-Culottes were also very important in terms of their pushing away from constitutional monarchy and essentially trying to challenge this system of constitutional monarchy that we're seeing. While the constitutional monarchy tried to balance power and tried to essentially have the National Assembly be the most, or the Legislative Assembly specifically, be the most powerful institution, and just maintain the symbolic nature of the monarchy to try and keep essentially the conservatives on side. While this is the case, these radical groups, the Jacobins, and the Sans-Culottes, began to push for more profound, radical, and republicanist changes. The economic reforms, as well as this, things like, for example, the ban on unions, also pushed more of the working classes into this radical sector. The church reforms, again, also alienated the devout Catholics, which would then start to fuel counter-revolutionary and royalist sentiment. All of this then leads to a point at which we see a sort of alienation of a great number of groups within the society, and the attempts to establish the constitutional monarchy becomes a lot more controversial when we think about it from this particular angle. And so when we think sort of conclusively then about the attempts to establish constitutional monarchy, we can see that these attempts were indeed transformative. They did attempt to dismantle the old Ancien Regime and introduce a government which was based instead on more Enlightenment principles, the sort of idea of equality, the idea of liberty, the idea of popular sovereignty. But ultimately, there were significant challenges associated with these reforms. The alienation of the church with the church reforms, the alienation of a number of the economic sectors within society. The reforms themselves seem to represent a favouring of the bourgeois class against that of the workers and the peasants. And then you've got the final sort of end point at which this really does collapse, which is, of course, the fact that the king lacked cooperation within this particular new constitutional monarchy. This would ultimately lead to his eventual trial and execution, but we'll get to that in future lessons' time.